Have you ever noticed how strange procrastination actually is? You're not avoiding something meaningless. You're avoiding something important. You sit down to do it. You even want the result. You know it would improve your life. And yet, you don't start. Instead, you check your phone. Then you suddenly remember you need water. Then email. Then you clean something that didn't bother you 5 minutes ago. And while you're doing all of that, there's a quiet tension in your chest. You tell yourself, I'll do it later. And the moment you say that, you feel relief, not happiness. Relief, which is strange, because the task is still there. So why does delaying it make your body calmer? What if procrastination isn't laziness, and it isn't lack of discipline? What if procrastination is your brain trying to protect you from a feeling you don't even realize you're avoiding? Because you're not actually delaying the task. You're delaying what the task might say about you. And once you understand that, procrastination stops looking like a productivity problem. It starts looking like something much deeper. And before we go deeper into this, I want to pause for a moment. Not to interrupt the message, but to anchor it. If while listening you felt even a small discomfort, a subtle recognition, that strange sensation of, this is describing me, don't ignore it. That reaction matters. Awareness begins exactly there, in the moment you stop treating the feeling as random and start seeing it as a pattern revealing itself. So take a second right now and gently support this conversation by liking the video. Not for the channel alone, but because that simple action signals to the platform that this kind of deeper content should reach more people who are silently struggling with the same inner dialogue. There are many people living under the weight of a voice they never chose, and sometimes a single video reaching the right person at the right time can interrupt years of unconscious repetition. And I also want to invite you into this, not as a viewer, but as a participant. In the comments, write something simple. Even just, I've felt this. Or, if you feel ready, share a sentence your mind repeats when you hesitate, doubt yourself, or hold back. You don't have to explain your story. Just naming the pattern already weakens its control, because what stays hidden stays powerful, and what is seen begins to loosen. And if you want to keep exploring this work, understanding subconscious patterns, separating your real identity from inherited conditioning, and learning how to reprogram your inner dialogue, subscribe to the channel. This space isn't about quick motivation or surface advice. It's about slowly dismantling the invisible architecture shaping your decisions, your confidence, and your reality. Now, let's go deeper. When you begin observing this process more closely, something unexpected happens. You start realizing the problem was never only what you think, but where the thought comes from. Most people believe their inner dialogue is spontaneous, that the phrases appearing in their mind are personal conclusions, almost like independent opinions about life. But when you slow down and really listen, that voice doesn't sound entirely new. It sounds familiar. Maybe it appears the moment you consider changing direction. When you think about trying something bigger, more visible, more aligned with who you truly are. A subtle tension rises in your chest, and with it, a sentence automatically forms. Better not. This isn't for you. This won't work. And without noticing, you're not making a decision. You're responding to emotional programming. The subconscious mind is not a logical system. It is a protection system. During childhood, you didn't have autonomy, context, or experience to interpret reality independently. You depended on the emotional signals of your environment to feel safe. A child's brain doesn't ask, is this true? It asks, does this preserve connection? And whatever maintained emotional attachment was recorded as safety. That is why certain words became so powerful, not because they were objectively accurate, but because they carried emotional weight and authority. A criticism spoken in frustration, a look of disappointment when you tried to express yourself, a small sentence. You're too sensitive. Don't overdo it. Don't aim too high. For an adult, these may sound ordinary. For a developing nervous system, they become identity. Your brain learned quickly. Expression creates tension, so reduce expression. Visibility creates discomfort, so reduce presence. Ambition creates concern, so reduce expectation. You didn't choose this consciously, you adapted emotionally. And adaptation, when repeated, becomes pattern. Pattern becomes belief. Belief begins operating as personality. This is where self-sabotage is born. Not from weakness, but from unconscious loyalty. Because the inner voice that seems to limit you is not trying to destroy you. It is trying to prevent an old emotional pain. The problem is that it still reacts to a context that no longer exists. You are no longer the child who depended on approval for safety, but your nervous system still interprets certain situations as threats to belonging. Sharing your ideas may activate the same vulnerability you once felt when judged. Asking for what you deserve may trigger the same tension you sensed when resources felt scarce. Speaking your truth may awaken the same fear of rejection you once experienced when connection felt uncertain. So the mind creates rational explanations. It calls it realism. It calls it caution. It calls it maturity. But often, it is protection disguised as logic. The inner critic does not sound like an enemy. It sounds responsible. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like someone trying to help you avoid disappointment. And that is why it holds so much authority inside your identity. Because at one point in your life, obedience meant connection, and connection meant safety. But something important changes the moment you recognize this. You begin to see that many of your automatic thoughts were installed before you had the ability to question them. Your limiting beliefs were not created by conscious choice. They were encoded through emotional repetition during years when survival depended on attachment. And when you see that clearly, a small separation begins to form. Not rejection of your past, not blame. Awareness. You start noticing how often hesitation appears exactly when expansion is possible. How doubt intensifies right before growth. How the same phrases repeat across different areas of your life. Relationships, career, money, visibility, confidence. That's not coincidence. That's conditioning. The inner critic is not your identity. It is a learned survival strategy. And once you realize that, you stop fighting yourself and you start listening differently. Because the voice is no longer absolute truth. It becomes information. It becomes history. It becomes something you can observe rather than obey. You begin asking new questions. Is this fear current or remembered? Is this caution wisdom or conditioning? Is this thought mine or inherited? And this is where mindset work actually begins. Not by forcing positivity, not by pretending you feel confident, but by recognizing that the internal narrative shaping your behavior may have been written long before you were conscious enough to author it. So the mind creates justifications. At this point, something even more subtle starts revealing itself. You don't just hear the voice anymore. You begin noticing when it appears, and the timing is never random. It rarely shows up when you are comfortable, distracted, or moving through routine. It shows up right before visibility, right before change, right before a decision that could move your life forward. The moment you consider charging more for your work, the moment you think about speaking openly, the moment you imagine becoming someone different than you've always been, that is when the resistance activates. And what's interesting is that it doesn't arrive as panic. It arrives as reasoning. The mind says, wait a little longer. You need more preparation. You're not fully ready yet. Maybe later. You interpret this as maturity, responsibility, even intelligence. But what you are actually experiencing is the nervous system protecting familiarity. Your brain is not built to prioritize fulfillment. It is built to prioritize predictability. The known, even when uncomfortable, feels safer than the unknown, even when full of possibility. So when you begin stepping outside the identity you practiced for years, the subconscious does not interpret it as growth. It interprets it as risk. Risk of judgment. Risk of rejection. Risk of losing belonging. And belonging, especially in early emotional development, was everything. That is why self-doubt intensifies exactly at the edge of expansion. The inner critic is not activated by failure. It is activated by potential. Because potential threatens the structure the mind spent years stabilizing. The identity you lived in became organized around certain expectations: how much you can ask for, how visible you should be, how confident you are allowed to feel. When your actions begin contradicting those expectations, friction appears. Not external friction, internal friction. You hesitate before sending the message. You rewrite the post 10 times. You delay the opportunity. You suddenly feel tired, uncertain, distracted, and you assume you lack discipline. But this is rarely about discipline. It is about identity coherence. The mind wants your behavior to match the story it believes about who you are. If your internal narrative says, "I'm not the type of person who succeeds publicly," then success itself creates psychological tension. To resolve that tension, the brain will either update the identity or stop the behavior. Most of the time, it stops the behavior. So you postpone, you minimize, you rationalize. And afterward, the inner voice explains the outcome. See, it wasn't meant to be. Not realizing the same voice created the hesitation that prevented the result. This is the loop of subconscious programming. A belief shapes perception, perception shapes action, action produces outcome, outcome reinforces belief. The cycle feels like evidence, but it is actually repetition. And because it repeats quietly, it becomes invisible. You might even notice a strange pattern. Every time progress is close, something inside pulls you back toward the familiar version of yourself. Not dramatically, subtly. A missed opportunity, a delayed decision, a safer choice. Your mind isn't asking, "What will make me grow?" It's asking, "What will keep me emotionally safe?" And emotional safety was once defined by staying within certain limits. Limits created long before you had conscious awareness of identity. That is why the inner critic sounds convincing. It is anchored in old emotional memory, not present-day reality. So the resistance you feel before change is not a sign you are on the wrong path. Often, it is a sign you are approaching a new identity your nervous system has never practiced before. The discomfort is not evidence of incapacity. It is evidence of unfamiliarity, but the brain confuses unfamiliar with dangerous. And this is where many people retreat. They interpret discomfort as intuition. They think, if it feels scary, it must not be right. Yet growth almost always requires stepping into emotional uncertainty before the mind updates its internal map. You are not afraid of the action itself. You are afraid of becoming someone your past identity never rehearsed. The inner critic tries to keep continuity. It prefers a smaller certainty over a larger possibility, because a smaller identity is predictable. A larger one demands adaptation, visibility, and self-trust. Things your earlier environment may never have trained your nervous system to tolerate. So instead of expansion, the mind offers protection. It says you need more time, more proof, more validation. But what it truly wants is reassurance that you will not lose emotional security by changing. And here is the important realization. The voice is not trying to sabotage your life. It is trying to prevent an emotional experience it once learned to associate with danger. The problem is that emotional memory is outdated. Your present reality is not your past environment, yet your internal dialogue is still reacting as if it were. Once you understand this, hesitation begins to look different. You stop interpreting it as personal weakness. You start recognizing it as inherited conditioning responding to new possibility. And in that awareness, a different kind of choice becomes available. Not the absence of fear, but movement alongside it. If this feels familiar, write in the comments, "I see the pattern." Sometimes naming a pattern is the first moment you step outside of it. And if this conversation is helping you understand your own subconscious patterns, you can support the channel with a like and subscribe so you can continue this identity work with us. Now comes the part most people misunderstand about inner work. Once you recognize that the voice in your head isn't entirely yours, the natural instinct is to fight it. You want to silence it, overpower it, push it away. You start telling yourself, "I shouldn't think like this," or "I need to get rid of this insecurity." And for a moment, that feels empowering, until you notice something unexpected. The harder you try to suppress the voice, the louder it becomes, because the inner critic was never designed as an enemy. It was designed as protection. Your nervous system does not distinguish between psychological threat and physical threat as clearly as you think. When a pattern helped you avoid emotional pain in the past, embarrassment, rejection, humiliation, loss of connection, the brain stored it as a survival strategy. The critic is not attacking you. It is preventing a scenario it once learned was unsafe. That's why when you attempt to shut it down aggressively, your body tightens. Anxiety increases. Overthinking accelerates. The system interprets your resistance as danger. Instead of dissolving the pattern, you activate it. So the real shift in mindset reprogramming is not suppression, it is separation. There is a psychological difference between saying, "I'm insecure," and saying, "A part of me feels insecure." The first statement fuses your identity with the pattern. The second creates awareness, and awareness changes authority. You begin to notice something subtle but powerful. You are the one hearing the voice, which means you are not the voice itself. This is the beginning of conscious identity work. Instead of obeying every thought automatically, you start observing it. The tone, the phrases, the timing. You may even start recognizing familiarity. Certain sentences sound strangely specific, almost as if they belong to someone else you heard long ago. A teacher, a caregiver, a moment you forgot consciously but your nervous system never forgot emotionally. Most internal dialogue is learned language. The subconscious mind stores emotional experiences as patterns, not as timelines. It does not label them past. It simply reacts when a similar emotional situation appears in the present. So when you prepare to take a visible step forward, speak, create, lead, express, the system activates old protective commentary to maintain stability. Not truth, stability. And stability to the brain equals safety. That is why shadow work is not about blaming your past or rejecting your upbringing. It is about recognizing that protection can outlive its usefulness. What once kept you emotionally safe can now limit your growth. The voice that once prevented pain can now prevent possibility. The moment you stop identifying with the critic, something important happens. You stop trying to destroy it. Instead, you start questioning it. You pause when the thought appears. Don't do it. You're not ready. You'll fail. And instead of obeying, you ask, where did this belief come from? When did I first feel this emotion? What was I trying to protect back then? You are not arguing with yourself. You are investigating your subconscious patterns, and investigation weakens automatic authority. Because the critic depends on invisibility. It works best when you assume every thought is fact. But once you see it as a pattern, a conditioned mental response, its power changes. The thought may still appear, but it no longer defines your behavior. This is not toxic positivity. You're not replacing fear with blind confidence. You're replacing unconscious reaction with conscious choice. Reprogramming the mind does not mean pretending fear disappears. It means fear stops being the decision maker. You begin responding differently. Instead of, "This is dangerous," you tell yourself, "This feels unfamiliar." That one change shifts the nervous system. Unfamiliar does not equal unsafe. It simply means new territory, and the brain can learn new territory through repetition and regulated experience. Each time you act while feeling uncertainty, calmly, intentionally, your nervous system updates its prediction. Visibility without rejection, expression without punishment, growth without abandonment. New emotional data begins replacing old emotional memory. Neuroplasticity is not dramatic. It is cumulative. The inner critic does not vanish overnight, but it loses authority. Its statements become suggestions instead of commands. You stop outsourcing your identity to inherited conditioning and begin forming it through conscious experience. And then a deeper realization appears. The voice shaped your behavior, but it was never your essence. There is an observing awareness beneath every thought, a steadier part of you that notices, evaluates, and chooses. The more you operate from that awareness, the less reactive the subconscious patterns become. You are no longer trying to win a battle inside your mind. You are updating an outdated operating system. The goal is not to eliminate the critic. The goal is to stop confusing it with yourself. If this helped you understand your internal dialogue in a new way, you can write in the comments, "I am not the voice." Naming the distinction strengthens awareness. And if you want to continue this deeper identity and subconscious reprogramming work, you can like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next step. Because in the next part, we're going to uncover how to identify the exact sentence from your early life that still influences your adult decisions. There is a moment in every identity transformation that feels almost invisible, but it changes everything. It is the moment you realize that awareness alone is not enough. You can understand subconscious programming. You can recognize inherited beliefs. You can even identify the tone of the inner critic. And still, the pattern returns. The same hesitation, the same doubt, the same emotional reaction before an important decision. Not because you failed to understand it, because the brain does not change through insight. It changes through repetition. Your subconscious mind was not built in one realization. It was built through thousands of small emotional experiences repeated over time. The nervous system learned what to expect from life, from people, from yourself. And once the brain predicts something consistently, it begins organizing behavior around that prediction automatically. This is where real reprogramming begins. Every time the inner critic speaks, you are standing at a psychological crossroads. One direction is familiar. You agree with it, adjust your behavior, and reinforce the existing neural pathway. The other direction is subtle but powerful. You respond differently than your past would have. Not dramatically, not perfectly, just differently. Instead of withdrawing, you stay present. Instead of delaying, you take a small step. Instead of silence, you express a thought. Instead of avoidance, you tolerate discomfort. The brain pays attention to action far more than intention. When your behavior contradicts an old belief while you remain emotionally regulated, your nervous system receives new information. It begins updating its internal model of reality. What once triggered fear now produces neutrality. What once produced tension now produces possibility. This is how neural pathways weaken. The old voice predicted danger, but the predicted danger did not occur. The brain notices the mismatch. And gradually, prediction adjusts. This process is slow because it is biological. Your mind is not being convinced, it is being retrained. Think about how a child learns that the dark room is safe. Not by being told once, by entering it repeatedly without harm. Eventually, the body stops reacting. The fear was not removed by logic. It was replaced by experience. Your identity works the same way. If your subconscious learned that visibility leads to rejection, you must experience visibility without rejection enough times for the nervous system to update. If it learned that mistakes lead to shame, you must make mistakes and survive emotionally enough times for the pattern to loosen. Each experience becomes emotional evidence. This is why mindset work fails when it stays only intellectual. Affirmations without behavior feel false to the brain. But aligned action, even small, produces credibility. Your nervous system trusts experience more than thoughts. Over time, the inner dialogue changes. Not because you forced it, but because the brain now predicts a different outcome. Confidence is not created by repeating, "I am confident." It is created by accumulating proof that you can act despite uncertainty. And then you notice something unexpected. The voice that once stopped you becomes quieter, not gone, but less urgent. It begins to sound like background noise instead of authority. You still hear it sometimes, especially before growth, but it no longer determines your direction. Because identity is not what you think about yourself. It is what you repeatedly do while feeling uncertain. You become someone new through lived experience, not declaration alone. The subconscious does not need to be erased. It needs to be updated. And the update happens each time you choose expansion over protection, even in small moments no one else sees. When you speak honestly, when you set a boundary, when you share an idea, when you try again after hesitation. These moments look insignificant from the outside, but neurologically they are powerful. They reorganize perception. Eventually, your internal dialogue begins to support what your behavior has proven. The critic no longer warns you about every step because your nervous system has learned that growth does not equal danger. You did not silence the voice. You outgrew its prediction. This is the real meaning of self-confidence. Not the absence of doubt, but the reduction of obedience to it. And this is also why personal transformation feels gradual. There is rarely a dramatic turning point. There are hundreds of small moments where you respond differently than you used to. Each one slightly adjusts the architecture of your mind. You stop asking, "How do I get rid of this voice?" and start asking, "How do I live so its warnings become unnecessary?" Your life becomes the argument that convinces your subconscious. So before you finish this video, pause for a second and notice one area where you usually listen to the old script. A conversation you avoid, a decision you postpone, a step you delay. Choose one small action you can take differently this week. Not to prove anything to others, but to give your nervous system new evidence. If this resonated with you, you can write in the comments, "I choose a new pattern." Saying it reinforces intention. Leaving a like helps this message reach others who are still confusing protection with truth. And if you want to keep working on subconscious reprogramming, identity change, and conscious mindset development, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next conversation, because this is not about motivation. It is about gradually rebuilding the relationship between your mind and your reality.